From the Missouri School of Journalism, welcome to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. Even as the world's population has continued to grow, the world's farmers have more than kept pace. World cereal production has increased by more than 2% per year from 2006 to 2016, according to the United Nations. But the global food supply faces a new threat: climate change. Extreme weather, like the massive floods that hit the U.S. Midwest during planting season, and even the severe drought in Somalia this year, are becoming more and more frequent. Even as farmers face new challenges from climate change, they're also part of the problem. Agriculture generates about a quarter of man-made greenhouse gas emissions. So on this edition of Global Journalist, a look at the relationship between agriculture and climate change. And in a few minutes, we're going to get a look at the changes that is driving this both in Brazil as well as in Central America. But to kick things off, we're joined by Bruce McCarl. He's a professor of agricultural economics at Texas A&M University who researches this issue. He joins us now from Silverthorne, Colorado. Bruce, welcome.
Good morning.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you. Just, if you would, give us the big picture. There was a new report not long ago from the UN scientific panel that studies climate change. You are one of the co-authors of this report, and it found that land temperatures have risen 2.6 degrees Fahrenheit since the Industrial Revolution, and they're forecast to continue to rise. What does this mean for farming?
Well, farming is very vulnerable to the climate. What we see in farming is pests and water supplies and the general environment that agriculture operates in are all conditioned by how hot it is, what happens to the rainfall, how much flooding, how much extreme events we see.
Well, what about in, let's say, the U.S. Midwest? Like, what are some of the impacts that are being felt now? What can people expect in the future?
Well, since the 1950s and the start of climate change, the average acre of corn in the U.S. has moved north and west somewhere more than 150 miles, about half of that due to climate. So what that means is that the suitable area for farming is tending to shift some. The reason it's moving north and west in the Midwest is that's up in elevation and up in latitude.
Okay, so to cooler places, it sounds like, but where in places that used to grow corn, it's not like they're not growing anything, they're changing to other crops then.
Yeah, on the southern end of the Corn Belt, we see more incidents of cotton and sorghum and crops that used to grow further south. On the northern end, we see the Corn Belt expanding into the Dakotas and Canada, displacing wheat.
Okay, and so clearly then climate change is already affecting things, but in other parts of the world, it sounds like some of the changes will be more dramatic. Some of the challenges will be more dramatic. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, if you're in a country in the sub-Saharan area like Mali or one of them, there is no room to move north, so they can't really move to cooler areas, so this tends to be damaging, and that's true of an awful lot of the subtropical countries around the world.
Okay, and so these are areas that are affected by desertification, for example, and are already growing, drought-resistant crops like millet or sorghum, and they can't sort of change their way out of this problem.
It takes a great deal of research and adaptation of crop varieties to be able to maintain the current production. And in some cases, it just becomes unsuitable to grow the crops that they're currently growing.
Well, what does this mean for people, for farmers in places like this? You mentioned Mali, these countries in, say, sub-Saharan Africa or Asia, for example, where the environment just isn't suitable for making very easy changes.
In a lot of cases, it means farming becomes much more tenuous. In some cases, we've seen some out-migration. We also see it in coastal areas where land is subject to inundation and some flooding or saltwater intrusion. So we're seeing shifts in some areas that it just doesn't become remain suitable for farming.
Well, you mentioned that in the U.S. Midwest, some of the ways that farmers are adapting is by changing crops. There are different varieties of crops that are more suitable to a warming climate. What about in these more vulnerable areas? What are some of the changes that could be made? How can outsiders help?
Well, there's a couple of very key things that have to be done, one of which is many of the agricultural scientists are trying to breed crops that are more drought tolerant, less reliant on water, less vulnerable to, say, pest infestations. And then there's also the promotion of advanced agricultural practices. In some areas, not much fertilizer is used, and the increase in fertilizer would increase yields and perhaps offset some of the detrimental effects of climate change.
Well, as I mentioned in the introduction, agriculture is a major source of greenhouse gases. And this report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that you worked on that was produced in July, it really highlighted the way in which land use affects the planet and how just everyone's switching to electric cars or cutting back on coal-fired electricity. That's not going to be enough to stop sort of the most catastrophic effects of climate change. So what changes need to be made in how farmers use land?
Historically, about 25% of the increase in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere came from clearing land, moving it, say, out of forests and moving it into agriculture. There are arguments that we should put land back into forestry. I saw something the other day about 3.2 trillion trees are needed. But there's also tensions between that and being able to grow food. Also, if we do bioenergy, that displaces fossil fuel use and emissions, but again, it has tensions with land. So part of the question is, how do we continue to use the land and use it in a way that releases less greenhouse gases?
And what are some of those alternative uses? I mean, you spoke about efforts to reforest land that's already been cleared for farming. As a practical measure, it's hard to move people off of land that they're using.
Very much so, and it's also hard to get the information out there when many farms in many areas are quite small. But we can go to less intensive tillage. We can change some of our fertilization practices to be more precise. We can change some of the ways we raise livestock. We can change the mix of meats that we eat. There are a number of different ways that this can be done, and also stopping tropical deforestation and the events like are going on now with the Amazon.
And we're going to hear about that more in just a moment. But Bruce McCarl, thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you.
This is Global Journalist. On today's program, we're talking about climate change and agriculture. Farmers all over the world, from Missouri to the South Pacific, are facing new challenges from the changing climate. Agriculture is also a major contributor to climate change, and that's perhaps nowhere more apparent than in the Amazon basin in South America. And so for more on this, we're joined by Rhett Butler. He's the founder and editor-in-chief of the environmental news site Manga Bay, which has been covering the recent fires in the Amazon closely. He joins us now from Menlo Park, California. Rhett, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you. As anyone who has been on social media or watched the news recently knows, there are a lot of forest fires in the Amazon right now. Just remind us quickly why the Amazon is so important to this discussion about climate change.
Well, the Amazon has lots of trees, and trees store carbon. So the estimate is that the Amazon stores at least 100 billion tons of carbon. And that's just in above ground biomass. And so the Amazon is a huge sort of storehouse of carbon. And it's when you deforest or burn the Amazon, it releases the carbon into the atmosphere.
And as I understand it, there is some research that indicates that as the Amazon gets smaller, it could sort of enter a death spiral where it wouldn't be able to recover. Talk to us a little bit about this. Yeah,
so this is a really important issue. So the the Amazon essentially acts as a giant water pump, and so it ends up creating a lot of its own through transpiration, creating a lot of its own rainfall. If you disrupt that ecosystem, it could tip towards a different type of biome. So from a rainforest where you have a lot of rainfall to something much drier, more like a savanna. And so that could, because you lose that ecosystem functionality, that could actually lead to the rainfall belt moving further north. And so that would deprive the southern Amazon and much of South America from that precipitation that farmers depend upon. And so if we were to see that tipping point reached, the Amazon would become a lot drier. It would release a lot of carbon. You'd also lose all that water that's currently feeding agriculture, cities, and the electricity grid across South America.
What role do farmers and ranchers have in the deforestation that's taking place now?
Ranching and farming is the largest driver of deforestation in the Amazon by far. So 70 to 80% of deforestation in the Amazon ends up as cattle pasture. So often the cycle is the trees are slashed and burned, and then a landowner will put cattle on the land for a few years, and then if the soil is suitable, once it's treated, then they'll do large scale soy agriculture. So again, I mean, the deforestation in the Amazon is all about agriculture.
There have been reports linking the U.S. trade war with China to the fires in the Amazon. Now, talk to us about how these two things may be linked. Because
of the tariffs on U.S. soy, a lot more soy is now being purchased by China from South America. So this would be Brazil, Bolivia, primarily also Paraguay. And so what that's done is it's driven up demand and prices for soy. So that's sending a signal to farmers in the Amazon that they've got this big new market which they can expand into. So that's kind of the direct link between, or the more direct link between kind of the trade war and what's going in the Amazon right now. There's also been some reports on links between the Trump administration and the Bolsonaro administration in terms of trying to foster more American investment in the Amazon region. So that's kind of a secondary factor.
Well, as the Amazon is depleted, is destroyed, what effect is there on farmers in Brazil and in neighboring countries if it acts like this giant sort of generator of rainfall?
So the implications could be very severe. So in the past few years, there have been some very significant droughts in the region. These droughts have affected transportation, electricity production, since about 80% of Brazil's electricity comes from hydropower, water availability in cities, and of course, agriculture. So again, these droughts have been sort of a preview of what could happen if the Amazon tips. If the Amazon does tip, then we're looking at disrupting sort of the very foundation for agriculture across much of South America. So I've seen estimates that 70% of South America's GDP is basically is in areas fed by rainfall from the Amazon, and a lot of that GDP is in the farm sector.
Well, Brazil's president, Jair Bolsonaro, he's received a lot of criticism over his government's response to these fires internationally. He's, been at pains to remind the world that the Amazon belongs to Brazil, or largely belongs to Brazil, not to France or to the United States. I mean, how can the international community work effectively to stop this deforestation without being perceived as sort of meddling in Brazil's internal affairs?
Yeah, I mean, Bolsonaro is correct in that the Amazon is Brazil's sovereign territory, but he's not really correct about that conservation should necessarily be seen as the enemy of Brazilian farmers. Again, the Amazon provides this critical ecological service that ranching and farming really depend on. So in terms of what the international community can do, I think it's been really interesting watching the Europeans kind of hold this trade agreement over Brazil's head, saying that if you've made these commitments to climate, but if you're going to have these policies in the Amazon that drive deforestation, you're going to undermine that commitment. So therefore, we're having second thoughts about this trade deal. Another thing that's starting to take off is targeting Brazilian companies. So there are a lot of Brazilian companies that are international players, so they sell a lot of farm products and meat products to consumers in the United States and Europe. And so, activists are talking about, okay, well, let's go after these companies and talk about doing boycott or some other pressure on them. So that sort of message can get back to the Bolsonaro administration. So those are kind of the two, I guess, tactics that are taking off right now. In terms of what the average consumer can do, I think voicing your concerns about what's happening, supporting groups that are working on the ground, and also thinking about the long-term. The long-term factor. So your own consumption. So are you consuming products that are linked to Amazon deforestation? Things like that. But also just getting an understanding of the policies, because in the short term, you put out these fires, and that's fine. But in the long term, it's really the policies that are driving this deforestation that could end up leading to this tipping point in the Amazon.
Well, Rhett Butler, thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Well, thanks for having me.
A reminder that you're tuned into Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. On today's program, we're talking about climate change and agriculture. If you're interested in more Global Journalist, check us out online at globaljournalist.org. You can also like us on Facebook, where we live stream, follow us on Twitter, get the podcast on Spotify and iTunes, or see our videocast on YouTube. Now, for the last segment of our show, we're going to move to Central America. Their changing rainfall patterns have made life particularly hard for farmers in the past few years. In Guatemala and Honduras, there's even evidence that climate change may be linked to the rising number of people trying to emigrate to the United States. So for more on this, we have Edwin Castellanos in Guatemala City. He's the Dean of Research at the Universidad de Valle de Guatemala. Edwin, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
And we're also joined by Georgina Gustin. She's a reporter for Inside Climate News, and she reported on this issue from Honduras earlier this year. Georgina, welcome.
Thanks.
Well, Edwin Castellanos, let me start with you. How is climate change affecting farmers in Guatemala now? Like, are the effects tangible? Can you see them on the ground?
Yes, in the last 2 decades, we have had a different change in terms of the rainfall patterns. In the first decade of this century, we had a series of extreme events that resulted in flooding and also a lot of landslides. But then for the last 7 years, we have had a lower than average rainfall. But more importantly, what we see is that the early rainfall in the rainfall season is disappearing.
So the rainfall patterns are shifting. And Georgina Gustin, you reported from Honduras, from a town called El Rosario. What about there? Were changes in climate apparent?
They're definitely apparent there. This is a small village of about 500 people at the edge of what's known as the dry corridor, which is an area of Central America with highly irregular rainfall that stretches from Mexico to Panama, encompasses a big part of Honduras. And they are going into their sixth year of drought this year, and they've watched over the last couple of years as their staple crops have failed because they've withered from the heat and they don't have enough water, and there are other exacerbating conditions like the forests around them are disappearing, so temperatures are going up and availability of water is going down. And again, this is a small village of 500 people. They don't have a lot of resources. They don't have the technical support that they need to adapt. And so they're really in a difficult situation because they can't feed themselves. Up until now, they've been okay, but now they're kind of as they go into this 6th year of drought, they're really struggling.
So it sounds like these are some of the most vulnerable people then that we heard Bruce McCarl talking about, because the food that they grow is what feeds them then. But Edwin Castellanos, if I could turn this back to you, as Bruce was mentioning earlier in the show, adapting to climate change for farmers in the Midwest may mean that they switch crops and change from growing corn to rice, for example, in some parts of the Midwest. What about for Guatemalan farmers? How can they adapt?
Well, it's important to understand that there are two types of farming going on in Central America. On one hand, we have a large-scale farming for export crops like sugarcane and bananas. And that farming operation is very similar to what you see in the U.S., so more technified and more resources in terms of trying to keep your crops going even under severe weather. On the other hand, we have the small farmers who are usually people below the poverty line. And these are farmers who really don't have much to work with in terms of adapting to these changes, particularly in terms of irrigation systems. Something as simple as having some place to store water and irrigate your crops when the rains don't come would make a huge difference to them, but they don't have that. And these people are usually growing food for their own consumption, mainly beans and corn.
Well, Georgina Agustin, you interviewed farmers in Honduras. Did they perceive that these changes were caused by climate change? I mean, how were they responding?
They are aware that there is a larger force. They're not denialists like you have that you see a lot of in other countries, particularly the U.S. They're very aware that what's happening to them is a consequence of a global climate transformation, and they have fewer options than American farmers. They don't have the government support. As Edwin said, this is what they grow, they eat, and what they don't eat, they sell, and so it's their income. And when they're faced with these conditions, they're in a very difficult situation, and they can leave. Those who have the resources can leave and maybe go to a larger city, but that's not a very appealing option in many cases. And that's increasingly researchers who've surveyed farmers and people living in the dry corridor. They've made the connection between the conditions they're dealing with and the migration northward, because when people don't have food, they have to leave and figure out how to make their living somewhere else. And so they're increasingly connecting the dots between what's happening on the ground in these small, poor villages and migration patterns.
Yeah, and Edwin Castellanos, if I could bring you back in, I understand that roughly half of the people who came to the U.S. southern border last year had been working in agriculture or farming before they migrated. How closely, at least in Guatemala, how closely are we able to draw that connection between the changing climate affecting farmers and their decision to emigrate?
Well, it is important to understand that these people have been living under poverty for many years, even before these changes in climate started to happen. And so people were already in a very difficult situation, and these changes in climate are just making things worse for them. And like we were saying before, they have very little resources to adapt to these changes. And so once you are already in a difficult situation, an additional stress like a change in climate might be enough to make you decide to leave your home and go somewhere else. It is important to understand also that making that decision is not an easy one. These people going away from their homes are doing so because they feel that they have no other options.
Well, Georgina Agustin, I know that you interviewed a number of farmers in El Rosario. If you could just tell us the story of maybe one farmer or one family who were experiencing this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's universal, really, across the village, because most of these people, I would say all of them, are farmers, and I spent a lot of time with a farmer named Nelson Mejia, and he's kind of a community leader. And I traveled with Nelson to cities around Honduras, to NGOs, to academic institutions, as he tried to learn what he might be able to do as a farmer to adapt to the changing conditions. And as a community leader, he was interested in learning all those things so that he could come back to the village and share what he'd learned with his fellow farmers. And these are traditional farmers. They don't have a lot of resources, and they've been farming corn and soybeans all of their lives. And so for them to transition to something else is kind of it's a difficult. It requires a shift.
This is a big step
mindset.
Because this is something that your father did, or your grandfather, or your grandparents, great-grandparents, and so on.
Right. Exactly. So he was trying to learn what he could bring that back to his fellow farmers in the village and share that with them. And you could tell that there was a lot of resistance to that, but also openness because they're under so much duress, or increasing openness because they realize that something has to change and they have to adapt. And they're scared. They're really scared. And they, as Edwin said, something really bad has to happen for them to want to even contemplate leaving their homes where they've lived all of their lives, and they're at the cusp of making that decision right now.
Edwin Castellanos, you were jumping in.
Yes, I was just going to say that changing crops requires not only new knowledge, which sometimes they don't have, but it also requires investment. And we were saying before, these people are already living at the poverty line, and so they don't have that additional resource to try a new crop.
So new seeds, new tools, things like this.
Not only the tools, but also the knowledge on how to grow the new crop. But they can also they cannot risk shifting to a new crop and failing because their lives depend on that crop.
Well, Ed, if I could just pick up on this with you, Edwin, the Trump administration has cut hundreds of millions of dollars in aid to Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador in response to some of these migrant caravans this year. What effect do you see that having? I mean, I think the intention was to encourage the governments to stop people from coming. Do you see that it's going to get that result?
It's actually going to get the opposite result because a lot of this money was actually going directly into the rural areas to help these people. In my university, for example, we had several projects going on with farmers in rural areas, and now we have to stop those projects because of lack of funding. And so the little help that these farmers were getting is no longer there anymore, and so they are having even less opportunities now to cope with these changes.
And Georgina Gustin, our time is growing short, but how do you see this issue changing over the next 5 years?
Well, I think it is going to become increasingly apparent to lawmakers in other parts of the world that something needs to be done to help smallholder farmers in Central America because this is not just a humanitarian issue. It's a political issue, and in the U.S. we've cut our aid over time, and we've also de-emphasized helping farmers over time, and I think there's going to be an increasing awareness that we have to help them, and that this is a crisis that a growing crisis that we're going to have to address with our dollars.
Well, Georgina, I'm sorry to cut you off, but we're out of time for this edition of Global Journalist, a production of the Reynolds Journalism Institute at the Missouri School of Journalism and KBIA Mid-Missouri Public Radio. Many thanks to Bruce McCarl, Rhett Butler, Edwin Castellanos, and Georgina Gustin. Our producers this week are Trevor Hook and Edam Kassaye. Benjamin Brink and Kyle McCubbin are our visual editors. Tia Thomas is audio engineer. Travis McMillan is director. Kathy Kiley is executive editor. For all of us at Global Journalist, I'm Jason McClure. Thanks for tuning in.